I think that 2020s will be the decade when it becomes increasingly obvious that the energy transition will not be the one we expect or that we hope for. The real energy transition, and this is the only one that is likely to happen in our lifetimes, will be a transition from using a lot to using a lot less, as Richard Heinbeck put it.
Stanley Wu, the coordinator for Omega and the director of the Resilience Project. Omega is a collaborative working on the global poly crisis and includes the Millennium Alliance for Humanity in the Biosphere, the Crans Foresight Analysis Nexus or FAN Initiative, and the Resilience Project. We're delighted to be joined by François-Xavier today, who has recently published a paper commissioned by the FAN Initiative entitled The Age of Energy Disruptions. We'll post a link for that in the chat just shortly. The briefing will be hosted by Joan Diamond and Nate Hagens, and I'm very much looking forward to this conversation. A little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the chat box to both panelists and attendees, and we will get to as many questions as we are able to. Also, please note that this webinar will be recorded and posted on the Omega website. Now, without further ado, I'll hand it over to Joan Diamond.
Okay, thank you, Stan. A few months back, I found myself in just recurring conversations, whether it was at Omega, the FAN, the Millennium Alliance, or over virtual dinner tables, given the world that we live in. And that question and those conversations focused on the global energy disruptions, which were obviously global, seemed unrelated, seemed unrelenting, and were simply perplexing people. The FAN Initiative, whose goal it is to foster an understanding of the dynamics driving global disruptions, commissioned a paper that would connect the dots, that would help make sense of these global energy events. We asked François-Xavier to write the paper and to brief us today. I've asked Nate Hagens, educator, craftsman, craftsman of powerful narratives that explain the human condition and the poly crisis, to host today and to introduce Francois.
Thanks, Joni. On normal days, that would have been me calling you, but in this case, it was not. So welcome, everyone. I'd like to introduce my friend, mon ami, François-Xavier Chevallerau. Francois is a policy and business consultant with over 20 years of experience in management and policy consulting, mostly within the European Union and international institutions. Francois created the Biophysical Economics Policy Center, an international network and think tank working to promote the concept of biophysical economics, which is biology and physics applied to our economic system, in the public debate and the policy conversation worldwide. I met Francois 5 years ago at a energy conference with some of the other people on this call. And I would like to hand the mic over to my friend and colleague, Francois.
Thank you very much, Nate. Thanks very much also to John and to Stan for the introduction, and also for giving me the opportunity both to write this paper about the energy disruptions and for organizing this webinar, which will hopefully enable to get into a discussion about those issues with a wider community. So I'm going to share my screen. I have prepared a presentation for today. Okay, can you see it?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So basically, I'm gonna go through most of the key points that are made in the article. I assume that most participants in the webinar have read the article, so I'm not going to go through the detail of it all, but there are some key points that need to be repeated, and then I will try to expand this into a wider conversation about what can be done at this stage, right? So I called it this, the article and this presentation, the age of energy disruptions, just to make sure that, or to convey the message that basically we have entered a new age where energy is going to be the theater of disruptions at multiple ways at global level. And this is something which is likely to dominate our times moving forward. So try to get here. Okay, the energy shock. Last year, you have probably noticed that we experienced a sort of energy price shock in the fourth quarter, already in the third quarter, but mostly in the fourth quarter of last year, which was, according to IMF data, the worst since 2008, when the price of oil skyrocketed at some point to close to $150 per barrel. Contrarily to what happened in 2008, the energy prices do not seem to be going down as quickly as they rose, right? And high energy prices are still dominating the headlines in early 2022. And what is striking is that all energy fuels were affected by the price spikes across the world, mostly natural gas in Europe, as can be seen on the figure on the right of your screen. But basically all other fuels were affected. As a result, there was a spike, of course, in inflation across the world. It accelerated in developed economies and in the emerging economies as well. Concerning the developed economies, it spiked mostly in the US, much faster than in the euro area. But actually, in the euro area, we are also at a multi-decade high for inflation in most countries. This inflation spike, which dominates the economic conversation at this stage, is basically it mostly concerns stuff rather than services. It's the price of goods which is going up, as shown in these graphs about basically the various components of CPI in the US. It's core goods that are which see their price rising very fast, and all this is largely energy driven. Meaning that it is the price of energy which is rising faster than the other costs, and basically they are what is causing the cost of everything else to rise. So what lies beneath all this, as I try to explain in the article, if you look at the mainstream media, there are two main explanations that are commonly advanced. The first one is that there is a sudden and important mismatch between the demand for stuff that is experiencing a sharper than expected rebound from the pandemic lows and the supply that is struggling to ramp up as quickly. And that's the case for both goods, manufactured goods, and for energy. The result of this is, of course, the price of everything is going up, but it's not the only thing that is happening. And if that was the only cause of this energy price shock, then we could expect it to sort of resolve fairly quickly as there is a supply and demand adjustment. But beneath this, there is also something else, which is the dearth of investment in energy. As you probably know, the investments in oil and gas exploration and production have dropped after the price of oil collapsed in 2014. They never really recovered. They increased a bit in 2017-18, but then they dropped again in 2020 due to the pandemic. This drop is not, or some say not yet, compensated by investments in renewable energy, which are still falling very, very far short from what would be needed to power a real transition. The result is that the world is not investing enough to meet its energy needs, let alone its future needs, and there are increasing concerns about, well, basically the availability of energy supply in the coming years. So how did we end up in this situation, and what should we do about it? Basically, there are two competing narratives about what's going on in the world at the moment. The first one, of course, is that the first narrative is that we are facing a fossil fuels crisis, which is basically caused by our over-reliance on fossil fuels, that is on dirty, climate-wrecking, and increasingly unreliable energy sources. And in order to address and to solve this fossil fuels crisis, of course, we should accelerate the transition away from fossil fuels, invest far more in renewable energy, and that could usher in a period of renewed economic growth, shared prosperity, and increasing equality across the globe. Those who actually advance this narrative tend to believe that the only way to what we need to get there is just more political will, and that the only reason why we're not getting there at the moment is that there is a lack of political will. The second narrative is that we're facing an energy transition crisis, which is caused by our misguided, premature, or excessive bets on clean energy sources. Therefore, the people who hold this view say that we should slow down on renewables investments and deployment and shift our focus and efforts towards energy security instead. And that would probably mean significantly reinvesting on fossil fuels, even if temporarily. And they say that what we need to do this is just political realism and courage. I would tend to argue that both of these competing narratives, of course, have some validity, but that overall they are only partial and that they only present part of reality, or rather that they are a little bit blind to reality. The first narrative, I would say, is energy blind, to use basically an expression that has been coined by Nate. It's basically immersed in energy blindness for various reasons. If you look at this graph about the direct primary energy consumption in the world over the last 250 years, you can see various things. First, that the defining driver of the human development is an endless quest for more and better energy inputs. And this means that human civilization gobbles up ever more energy to keep growing and expanding. That's basically what human civilization does. This is how we expand and improve the outputs that we obtain from our exosomatic energy use. And this is in turn how human societies acquire power over others and dominion over their environment. This is how basically they do what we call progress and growth. As they grow their energy use, humans never really transition from the one energy source to another. And I think this is clearly visible in the previous slide. There is no substitution of energy sources by others. Historically, the new sources of energy may displace pre-existing others as the dominant ones, but they never really substitute them, that supplement them. And it's quite clear also from this graph that there is no transition away from fossil fuels and into renewable energy underway. So far, the modern renewables only exist as an extension of, or to prefer an add-on to, the fossil fuel industrial and technological society. What we can say also about this historical overview of energy transitions is that new energy sources only come to supplement pre-existing ones in relative terms when and because they happen to be superior to those in terms of both energetic quality and energetic productivity. Energetic quality means the capacity to be converted into useful work through exosomatic devices and infrastructure. And energetic productivity means the capacity to provide usable energy in excess of the energy consumed in the extraction, transformation, transport, and delivery process. The reason why fossil fuels dominate our energy systems to such an extent is not just because of their abundance, it's not also not just because of the malevolence of fossil fuel industries. It's because fossil fuels are incomparably superior in energetic terms to anything we were able to use before them, and also to anything we have started to use after them. And that includes nuclear and renewables. what it means is that contemporary human progress fundamentally and unfortunately has been from a fossil fuel process. And on all the aspects that determine or influence energetic quality and productivity, solar and wind energy do not seem to be superior to fossil fuels in the same way as fossil fuels were to pre-existing energy sources. In fact, they rather seem to be significantly inferior. Overall, the biophysical examination, as well as the empirical evidence that is available so far, shows that the capture of diffuse and intermittent energy flows and their conversion to electricity through man-made devices is an imperfect substitute for the extraction and burning of fossil fuels. Therefore, it might not be able to provide the same services and value to society, or not on the same scale. And unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be any amount of innovation that is likely to fundamentally change that. In the light of the patterns that have been defining our energetic and civilizational course, the expected total or partial replacements this century of fossil fuels by renewable energy sources would therefore constitute, first of all, a systemic change without any kind of precedent in human history. Remember, there hasn't been any transition so far. And secondly, it will represent a fundamental reversal of humanity's energetic course towards higher quality, higher productivity energy sources. From an energetic, but also from an economic point of view, it would constitute not an upward transition, but rather a downward transition. That means a move towards a lower quality, lower productivity energy system, only capable of supporting reduced population and economic footprints. And there is no empirical evidence to date supporting the hypothesis that such downward shift could be compensated by decoupling of economic growth from energy and material throughput. Right. So what does it mean? Well, it means that this first narrative, as I said, is energy blind. It doesn't necessarily validate the second narrative, because the second narrative is reality blind in a different way. It's rather ecology blind. And it basically ignores the fact that fossil fuels are both certainly the lifeblood and the essential feedstock of our techno-industrial civilization, but they are also the drivers and enablers of civilizational overshoots. You know all these graphs about the exponential curves of various socioeconomic trends, but also Earth system trends that has been called the Great Acceleration by some Swedish researchers, I think. Basically, at a stage where we are, there is enough knowledge about all this to say that denying the fact that most of the remaining fossil fuels need to be left in the ground is consciously accepting the risks that climate change, as well as the other consequences of civilizational overshoots, might cross dangerous thresholds. They destabilize the Earth system and put at risk basically the planet's hospitality to biological life. In addition, the second narrative is also ecology blind in a different way, because it also ignores the fact that we are relying on energy sources that are fastly depleting. Just like all non-renewable natural resources, fossil fuels are stock-based, they are exhaustible, they are subject to depletion. That means that there are rising constraints on the quantities and the costs of the resources that can be obtained, but also that their quality is inevitably going down. And depletion inevitably degrades over time the return on investment on new energy exploration and production. And hence it progressively depresses investment. In fact, it's not just the effect of climate policy or price variations which is affecting investments in oil and gas and coal. It's fundamentally depletion, which is the reason why investment in fossil fuels has been trending down over the last few years and will continue to do so in the future. Accelerating fossil fuel depletion is really what lies behind the headlines about our energy crisis. So even if we ignore the climate emergency completely, and if we put it aside, It's certainly not in our interest to just accept that we should maintain our dependency on fossil fuels. You know, I guess, this situation. The oil discoveries are at their lowest point since the Second World War. That was the case already before the pandemic. There is a growing supply gap, which has been identified by most energy analysts about the future of oil. Basically, we assume that the oil that we think we will need over the next decades will come from somewhere, but we don't know where at the moment, right? So basically, where does that leave us? And of course, if you want to have more explanations about all these points, there are more details in the article. So I would say we have entered the age of global energy disruptions, and most likely we will never really get out of it. Now, global energy disruptions form part of our experience of life on Earth, well, for all of us alive today. Our energy future is likely to be one of increasing scarcity and rising costs. Increasing scarcity and rising costs of fossil energy as a result of the inescapable and mounting impacts of depletion and of its consequences, and that includes the erosion of spare production capacities, the weakening of and breakdown of supply chains as some producers basically run out of the stuff, depression of investment. And there will be also an increasing scarcity and rising costs of energy in general, because the relentless addition of supposedly cheaper alternatives to fossil fuels will keep, in fact, increasing the overall cost and complexity of our energy systems. I think the 2020s will be the decade when it becomes increasingly obvious that the energy transition will not be the one we expect or that we hope for. The real energy transition, and this is the only one that is likely to happen in our lifetimes, will be a transition from using a lot to using a lot less, as Richard Heimberg put it. And I think the coming years will make this increasingly clear to an increasing number of people. So I would say that we are caught definitely between a rock and a hard place. We are painted ourselves in a very tight corner. The relationship that we have developed with fossil energy over the last 250 years is a textbook definition of an addiction, but it also increasingly looks like a Faustian pact or Faustian bargain. We know that this is killing us. We know we should be leaving it in the ground. We know that we will someday have to live without it, but we just can't stop burning it and we can't get enough of it, because we have basically grown our world and also multiplied our numbers around it. All the detox replacement medications that we are using to treat our addiction, and that means mostly renewables, they don't seem to be working so far. And therefore, even as we keep increasing the doses of those replacement medications, we keep relapsing into our fossil fuel addiction. Even if we actually keep pledging to try harder and harder to get clean in the future. And that's what we did again at COP26 just a few months ago. What we are now left with, I think, is a choice between either crashing down the economy, because this is what the accelerated drop of greenhouse gases emissions that is needed to meet our climate pledges would mean, and that's regardless of how much we invest in wind and solar, or letting modern civilization burn itself to the ground, which would be the likely result of failing to slash the emissions that quickly, because then climate change and, as I said, other signs of civilizational overshoot would risk crossing dangerous thresholds and profoundly destabilizing the Earth system. An economic meltdown combined with a failure to contain the Earth system destabilization, it looks like it's would be the worst case scenario, but it's unfortunately becoming an increasingly plausible outcome. So what is to be done? And of course, we will have the possibility to discuss all these elements in detail in a few minutes, but just some thoughts about what is to be done. As I said, the only energy transition that we're likely to live in our lifetimes would be a transition from using a lot to using a lot less. In other words, it's about degrowing our energy use and mostly degrowing our energy and material throughputs. And it's increasingly being called degrowth, both in academia and in the policy conversation. Can we really convince the world to willingly degrow before it is too late? That's the key question. Can we convince citizens to accept degrowth and governments to impose it on citizens? Well, that's of course subjective, but in my opinion, the answer is a resounding no. Developed and developing societies alike will not, because they cannot choose to degrow. And governments cannot and will not impose it, because doing so would defy their historical function and purpose. I think that if such a choice would be made somewhere, it would quickly prove detrimental to the material circumstances of the majority of the population. It would exacerbate tensions and dissensions in societies. And of course, it would make it possible for other human groups across the world to seize the opportunities to achieve higher energy and material throughputs, because this is the way you actually change the patterns of economic power and domination at global level, which is the stated strategic objectives of some countries across the world. And that's basically how the world works and has been working all along. So in little time, I think the decision to degrow, if it would be taken, would most probably be reversed, or the governance regime would be overthrown. Degrowth is an important intellectual concept because it helps to understand the nature of our predicaments, but it has little political value. Bringing humanity down to sustainable levels of energy and material throughputs, and that's again, in my opinion, and it's impossible, it's incompatible with democracy and civil liberty. So what is to be done? Well, I think what I said may sound, of course, quite negative and depressing, but I think it doesn't mean that we should just wait and do nothing. The difference between the least bad options and outcomes and the worst ones could still be quite dramatic in terms of the impacts and the consequences for the biosphere and for the human species. However, I think it's probably easier to do something useful once we understand and accept that the best we can hope for is damage control rather than a better and brighter future for all. I would thus, sorry, I'm getting back to the previous slide. I would thus advocate for focusing on fostering a progressive cultural change through pushing for a few pragmatic yet potentially high impact measures. And I think the most important one that I can think of is to try to substitute the profit motive as the main driver of innovation and progress. Substitute it by something else. It has already been tried in the past to substitute the profit motive by something else. It didn't end very well. I think there is a possibility with the evolution of the perception of all the the polycrisis or the predicament to actually foster something else and to use it as a driver for innovation and progress. And that thing is cooperation, because it's a substitute for the profit motive that does not suppress individual freedom and self-interest. There is an organizational model to do this, which is the cooperative and mutualist model. And I think there is a sort of natural match between, let's say, the concerns for the polycrisis and the cooperative movement. So we should, in my opinion, let 1,000 cooperatives and mutuals bloom. Basically, the cooperative model can be applied to almost all human activities and should be used across the board. It should, well, we should try to make it replace the corporation as the by default way of organizing human activities. A second key measure, or let's say measure, yes, or something that could be promoted and that could potentially have a high impact, is to reorient the production model and the pricing valuation of everything through shifting the focus of taxation from labor to the use of non-renewable resources. And that could progressively, well, have a very, very significant impact on what we do, how we value things, and what is actually successful in the market. Third thing is, and that's of course a long-term endeavor, but we definitely need to ingrain systemic thinking into the public psyche and into the public conversation. And of course, that means promoting mathematics and science and physics and way beyond where they are today. But most of all, that means promoting system science and pushing it into the education system at all levels, in higher education, but also in primary and secondary education as much as possible. We need to make sure that the next generations are capable of thinking in systems and to understand the consequences of their acts from a systemic point of view. Right, so three possible measures moving forward: cooperation in terms of, well, organization of human activities, shifting the focus of taxation, and promoting system science in education. Okay, I've finished with my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention, and we can now move on to the discussion.
If you could put some questions in the box, I will facilitate them. I have a lot of questions myself, and I'll start with one while people populate their questions. What's going on in Europe right now with respect to energy prices relative to the rest of the world? And is the general European citizen very aware and afraid of what's going on with Ukraine and Russia with respect to risk that might upset future natural gas shipments to Europe? Is Europe becoming a little bit more a little less energy blind than the rest of the world because of what's happening this winter, et cetera?
Well, what I can say is that, well, energy prices are still extremely high in many countries in Europe. I'm not sure Europeans are becoming less energy blind, but they are becoming much more aware of their dependence to Russian gas, that's for sure. And they are very much concerned about what's going on in Ukraine, what may happen in Ukraine in the coming weeks. Of course, they're willing to try to lower their dependence on Russian gas moving forward. How they will do this is unclear at this stage, and I think that nobody really has a plan for shifting the energy system in a way that makes Europe less dependent on Russian gas. At the moment, Europe is importing increasing quantities, increasing amounts of US LNG, but of course that comes with a higher cost, and that cannot reach the kind of quantities that are being delivered by Russia through pipelines. So it's a short-term move, but it's not really something that is going to ease the crisis.
Okay, thank you. Question, Francois, what timeframes do you have in mind for effectively involving the three shifts that you outlined at the end of your presentation?
Well, these are, of course, things that would have an effect over the medium to long term. These are not short-term measures. But this is something that is, in my opinion, more likely to be accepted by societies than confronting the problem head-on by insisting that society must degrow by 7% every year, right? So in terms of time frame, I think this is something that can have some significant impacts already during this decade. The impacts will unfold over time, but already this decade, if we manage to push these three measures, it could have very quick and decisive impacts, especially the taxation shift. If that would happen very quickly, which it won't, of course, but if that was the case, then that would have a tremendous and very quick effect on the economic system.
Follow-up question to that: to what extent is nuclear power an acceptable energy source, and has the opinions of that changed with what Germany's done with energy, wind, and also what's happening this winter with the spike in prices?
Yeah, well, the debate about nuclear is shifting a bit in Europe, and there are some countries, several countries, that insist that nuclear needs to be included in future energy plans. They actually won a battle recently because the European Commission decided to include nuclear, but also I think natural gas in its taxonomy of sustainable investments, which is sparking quite some controversy over here. But basically the Germans are not regretting their choice yet, as far as I know. There is still a majority of people in Germany who oppose nuclear energy and who don't want to hear anything about nuclear energy, and who certainly don't want Germany to invest in nuclear power. That may change in the future, but Germany is the richest industrial nation in Europe, and it still has the means to keep investing in renewables. It actually just announced very ambitious plans for renewables deployment. You can still finance it, and of course that's still the intention. I think what's dominating here in Europe is the perception. It's the first narrative, if you will. It's the narrative that basically we are in a fossil fuels crisis, and we need to accelerate the transition away from fossil fuels. That is still so. Does that reduce our energy or solve or ameliorate our energy blindness? I don't think so.
So we have lots of questions now, but let me put you on the spot on this past question. What is your personal view on whether nuclear is viable given what we're going to need to do in the future?
I would say in the short term, it could be a viable option, but it's an option. It's a solution at the margin because it doesn't really solve the crux of the problem. It's something that really can soften a little bit the dissent. The debate is still not really settled as to whether nuclear is an adequate complement to renewables. Some say yes, others are not convinced. But I would say that it's certainly a major mistake to close down nuclear power plants that are already operating before closing down, for fossil fuel power plants. And that's what Germany did. I think it's not the right way to basically address the problem. Nuclear power plants that are existing, that are still producing and that are still considered as safe, could still produce for a few decades. The key question is, should we invest in new power plants, new technology, new generation reactors? And that's a tricky question because it could certainly help and make sure that we can maintain some levels of energy deliveries that are somehow compatible with what we are used to in developed economies. At the same time, nuclear energy is very complex. It can only be fully controlled and mastered by a society that is complex and that can maintain its own level of societal complexity. I do believe that, as you know it, Nate, we are facing the prospect of a great simplification. And I doubt that moving forward, advanced societies will be able to maintain the level of socio-technical complexity that is required to make sure that they can operate nuclear reactors in a very safe way.
Well, thank you for that cue in to me allowing to announce to this group that today I did launch my podcast, thegreatsimplification.com, discussing these topics. But back to the question, here's two questions I'm going to merge together. And then I might have some personal insight here after you answer. Among other challenges, there's the challenge of scale. Mutual aid and cooperation are most applicable at small scale. The challenge of shared values and trust, and the challenge of timeframes. I think operating at a high scale on policy like taxing non-renewables makes sense, but is there a political or policy approach to governance regarding downscaling? And then from another person, but related question, what policies can be followed to bring the message to the economic elites if they are made aware of the risks and that it is in their benefit to participate in degrowth to have a future, things may work?
Well, I don't think there is any governance mechanism that is really fit for what we are facing, or that is naturally suited for actually managing this effectively. As I said, I think that apart from tribal settings, the governance mechanisms in any complex society is inherently made to serve the purpose of increasing energy and material throughput, not decreasing it. So I do not think that we will manage to convince the elites across the world that degrowing is in their interest. And this is basically why I insisted on focusing on pragmatic measures. And the pragmatic measure that I see, which could help, influence governance systems, is precisely to develop and foster cooperativism in order to solve our problems, or not really to solve them, but to address them. We need to either create a religion or a political party. A religion, we'll leave that to others, but a political movement, that could be a sort of cooperativist movement. There are ways to advance the cooperative thinking and to foster the development of cooperative organizations, as I said, across the board for all human activities, including for governance activities. We could think of an evolution of democratic governance towards cooperative mechanisms. And I think this is something that should be also researched and that could also be promoted, including by people who are working on the human predicament and the polycrisis.
On that note, I'll just do a little bit of an aside here, FX. I'm working in Washington, D.C. on something we're calling advanced policy. I've talked to 25 former senators, governors, congressmen about the meta crisis, about the linkage between money, energy, debt, growth, and looking 2 or 3 steps ahead. Former politicians have the time, and they're not at risk of losing their status, so they can process this and think about it. Mm-hmm. The idea is to build research and blueprints and break glass plans for when these events come to pass. There is constituency awareness and plans put in place. And I think that the 2 problems is even these former politicians, all politicians are energy blind. They know that we have problems and they're very worried, and they're playing whack-a-mole every day with various crises that are unrelated to the things you presented here. But I think it is at least possible that you can build things ahead of time for when the social and political body is more, when the whack-a-mole arrives on our doorstep. And if that happens and there's no plans, then I agree with you that we're in trouble. And so I do think there is a possibility of informing who will be the leaders in 5 years or 7 years or 3 years or 12 years about these things. And I think that's worth doing. But let me kick it back and ask you this. Yesterday I had a long conversation with Paul Ehrlich about the difficulty of talking about collapse and the meta crisis and all these things. And what if we were to have, I think once things get to a certain level of scary or socially awkward to say, there's a ceiling on what can be said other than at your dinner party that's not being recorded. The fact that this call is being recorded precludes me from saying 1 or 2 things that I otherwise would have said. Scale this towards international diplomats and climate convening of parties in Glasgow and video and television sound bites. And there's a ceiling to what can be said. What if we had a conference with ecologists, systems analysts, energy experts, climate change experts, monetary experts, where nothing that they said could be attributed to them? There was some like Darth Vader voice synthesizer where people could say the truth without fear of them being publicly canceled. What would the recommendations at such a conference be relative to the conferences now we have, which are deferring to the silverbacks in the room and saying things that are a little on the edge, but maybe just to a level of being polite? Do you have any thoughts on that? Sorry for rambling.
Well, if such a conference could be organized, I would be very much willing to hear what these people have to say. I suspect that we would be quite surprised by the level of awareness of all these problems, which is much, much higher probably than what people are willing to admit in public. So I'm not sure actually that these experts in all these different domains, if they were, if they were able to voice their concerns and their thoughts very much anonymously, I'm not sure that they would come up with solutions any better than what we can come up with. They would probably still, focus their attention in terms of solutions to their own specific field of expertise and push for that without necessarily thinking about the systemic implications.
I agree with you, and I think it's because there is no one in charge. We have deferred our wisdom and constraint to the market, and the market is in charge of our aggregate decisions at the moment. Let me get back. There's a bunch of questions here. I'm behind. Social inequality has been growing worldwide. Francois, do your 3 suggestions work to reduce that inequality?
Yeah, certainly. Social inequality is a major issue, and both the promotion of cooperativism and the tax reform that I mentioned would be very much powerful instruments to reduce inequality and to make sure that that it's reduced to levels which are compatible with, a functional society capable of making decisions about its future. So yes, definitely, but I don't think addressing inequality through existing governance mechanisms will work any better than addressing climate change through existing governance mechanisms. I mean, we have seen where it has led us. There is no reason to think that what has been failing for decades is now going to start working. So that's why I'm rather inclined on promoting things that are attacking the problem sideways or it feels a bit that it may be attacking the problem sideways, but in the end, the combination of those things may have a more effective impact than trying to do traditional activism through existing governance channels.
Okay, getting back to the core of your expertise here, could you talk about the risks to agricultural productivity from this energy crisis? Agriculture is heavily reliant on fossil energy for nutrients, tillage, transit, etc. Yet climate impacts from heat, drought, storms are increasing, threatening harvest. Well, what do you think about all that?
I think it's of course a major concern. Both the climate impacts and the potential energy disruptions impacts on agricultural production are likely to be significant. And this is a key aspect where, of course, future leaders need to be made aware of what's in store and what are the risks and how they could potentially deal with those. But I don't have answers as to what's going to happen in the next few years about harvests and agricultural production. There is a major risk that either if we try to get rid of fossil fuels in agricultural production, or if we disregard the effects of climate change on basically soils and on agricultural regions, then we may be facing food shortages over the coming years. That's quite a significant risk, yes.
Which gets back to the inequality issue. So merging together some thoughts. What is the role for top-down things like we talked about, governance, advanced policy, and what is the role for grassroots or grass tops, bottom up? Because our politicians are a reflection of the people who elect them. So given the cultural transition ahead of us, how do you see top-down versus bottom-up engagement with our challenges?
I think it's still useful to try to pressure at the top so that there can be some sort of bottom-up action. But as I said, I don't believe this is going to deliver the systemic change that we need, because that would, as I said, defy the historical functions of our governance mechanisms. And yes, our leaders are a reflection of the people who elect them. In many countries, they don't elect them, but still they're reflection of the people they govern to a certain extent. They are, I think, much more decisively part of a system, and a system that has limited scope and margin for really changing. So I would say we should better focus on bottom-up action. And as I said, on sideway actions, instead of going upfront head-on against something that we know is not going to move, then we try to find other ways of making the system flip, right? And that needs to come from society. Society needs to become cooperative, more cooperative. We need to find ways of organizing this at all levels and for all purposes. And as I said, cooperativism is definitely something we should try to promote.
Do you have a distinct, discrete recommendation on a bottom-up behavior that either people on this call could think about, or you in your own life or your community, and anything specific?
Create a cooperative. Create a cooperative for everything. Transform university into a cooperative. Transform the school into a cooperative. Transform your business into a cooperative. Create an energy cooperative. Create a food cooperative.
Okay.
Try to think of all the activities that you do on a daily basis. Try to think of all the things you do for a living, and try to think about how all these things could be organized in a cooperative manner through a cooperative modus operandi and a cooperative governance mechanism. I
totally agree with that, and none of that is happening where I live, but I have to try to look into that more. Several more questions here. Why wouldn't Germany or California serve as models for how renewables can replace fossil fuels and try to replicate this? Sure, global trends are not encouraging, but there are models that offer hope.
Well, Germany and California and some others have certainly managed to push renewables much more than others, and that's certainly encouraging, but I wouldn't say that they are successful. It's too early to say whether they are successful or whether they will be successful.
Well, how did Germany's structure of renewables help or hinder what's going on right now with the skyrocketing prices in Europe?
Well, it didn't help too much in the last few months of 2021 because, of course, in those months, solar was not really helpful, and there was a season of very low wind across much of Europe. So let's say that this low wind also made matters worse in many countries, and that includes Germany, but also in probably most fundamentally the UK. But as I said, well, there is still a very much willingness in Germany to further invest in renewables. I would say it's not a success story so far. I mean, Germany is paying an awful lot of money and has been paying an awful lot of money over the last 20 years to install quite a lot of wind and solar generation capacity that has brought it to basically about 40% of its power generation that now comes from renewables. They want to grow that further, of course, and they will grow that further. But the result is also that Germany has the highest electricity prices in Europe. And Germany can afford this. German people can afford this. Most other people in other European countries cannot afford that.
Yeah. Okay. Another question. In many countries, whether independent or state-owned, utilities act almost as their own sovereigns. The utilities deploy either of your two narratives depending on who is their audience at the moment. Are there existing models of cooperative management of utilities with strong and appropriate citizen oversight that you would point to as a possible way forward? How much progress can we make through vigorous attempts to change the existing centralized utility model?
Well, there are more and more energy cooperatives being created in some parts of Europe. I don't know much about the US, but I think it happens in the US as well. But there are more and more energy cooperatives. So people coming together to actually install their own solar farm or wind farm close to where they live in a small community. That seems to be working well, and this is being actually by European energy policy, but it only exists on a small scale so far, and this is also one of the advantages of cooperativism. It fosters localism because it only works at a relatively small scale, or it works better at a relatively small scale, and that's something that can work, and that can also help people, realize what the energy transition entails and what living on a renewable energy supply means. And from that point of view, I think that's also something that could be encouraged, that should be developed. But there again, it's also an instrument towards smaller scale, more local management of the energy supply.
Wonderful. Hi, folks. I want to jump in here and just recognize really quickly that we are at the top of the hour, and I know that some folks need to move on with their day, but this is a fascinating conversation, and I believe that we can stay on here for another 15 minutes or so. So if folks want to stay on and continue listening into this conversation, please, we've got more questions to get to, join us, but I just wanted to mark that we're at the top of the hour.
Okay. Here's the next question, Francois. Multiple social tipping points will precede or coincide with energy and climate tipping points. Given such a reality, can we really still say that the process of taking dramatic action in a short time frames is any more of a challenge to democracy than the rampant inequality, resource scarcity, and other social stresses themselves are. In fact, democratic decision-making norms are going to be challenged with or without dramatic energy transition measures. Has the global response to COVID made you more or less hopeful about the ability of countries to work across borders and paradigms to achieve energy transition goals?
Not really. I mean, the response to the COVID-19 pandemic has shown that we still very much rely on technological fixes for addressing our global issues. We were quite lucky to be able to develop a vaccine in such a short period of time. That's something that never happened before, as far as I know. So this is certainly a technological achievement. And basically, the lesson that many will draw from this episode is that we can find technological fixes for pretty much everything, which is not the case for fixing what we discussed today. Does that make me much more hopeful? Well, that makes me more concerned that basically there will be even more focus on technological fixes, on techno-optimism, and sort of suppression maybe of contrarian voices, a little bit like on the pandemic. We are seeing a little bit of a suppression of some contrarian voices who have been not necessarily going along with this rush towards vaccination.
So what does give you hope, Francois, given everything you've outlined here?
What does give me hope? Yeah, well, I think there are still ways to live a meaningful life. And the best way to do this is to try to contribute to address some of these problems at one's own scale and based on one's own skills and capabilities. And I think if we really shift to a sort of cooperative mode of organizing society and activities, and that if it becomes our by default or our default organization or operational mode for doing everything we do, then that will enable everyone to actually contribute to do something useful. And that gives me hope, because this is something that can happen, that has not been tried hard enough. And I think this is definitely something that could have a significant impact.
Okay, building on that, a question on cooperatives. While being very much in favor of a cooperative transition, I wonder how best to address that the cooperative model does not address in and of itself ecological issues. In effect, co-ops are by design very strong on economic democracy, but very widely on moving away from ecologically extractive practices. It would, for example, be conceivable to transition to a cooperativist economy without addressing extractivist tendencies. I think that should be inconceivable. What are the most inspiring examples and applied models you are aware of that address this?
Well, yes. Well, cooperatives are only organizational models. They don't by themselves address the problems of pollution, extractivism, or resource depletion, or climate change. So, of course, in itself, even moving to a cooperativist organization doesn't guarantee that all these problems will be tackled. However, by their very nature, cooperatives are democratic organizations, or much more democratic organizations than corporations, or that top-down hierarchical organizations, for that matter. And this, in a public which is increasingly aware of those issues and of those challenges, is probably the best way to make sure that these things will be taken into account in the decision-making process of cooperatives.
Here's an
So-
energy, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, this promotion of cooperativism is not something that can go in isolation. It's part of a package of different things that need to be done. And in itself, it won't be sufficient, but that's, in my opinion, a necessary step towards trying to ameliorate our situation.
Here's a direct comment on energy that I missed from earlier. Innovated, non-mechanized means of heating and cooling must be employed en masse again, such as passive solar using thermal mass exterior walls, earthen tubes, attached greenhouses with insulated roofs that grow veggies, and a place to place heat pump condensers. And there were more comments.
Mm-hmm.
You know, my issue with things like that, or I think that's a great idea, but we're getting emotional signals of this future from the markets and the media, but deep down we're having podcast discussions like this, like, oh my God, all this stuff is coming. So we're confused. We're not getting the public approval to do all this, you know, lower energy throughput, simpler technology trajectory. So do you have any thoughts on all that?
Well, no, not very different from yours. All these ideas are very, very good, valuable, interesting. Of course, we need to promote these kind of things. But first of all, it's not going to solve the problem that we're facing, because it cannot scale up to basically replace the kind of energy deliveries we have gotten used to. And secondly, yes, it's also something that is not really helpful in terms of changing the narratives. So we can try to find solutions, small-scale solutions like this in the energy domain, but we need to also expand the discussion to well, something that goes beyond just finding energy solutions, right? We need to make sure that we see this as part of a culture change or revolution.
So building on that and getting back to your third point, what do you think are the most effective ways to educate the broader public, either on energy or on our systems situation? Are there interesting initiatives out there that are happening now?
Well, there are a lot of people trying to do this. Unfortunately, it's, you know, a little bit scattered all over the place. There is not much more something that federates all these efforts, and that's maybe what is missing. I know that's one of the visions of the FAN initiative, but we need something that goes really on a huge scale towards bringing all these thinkers, people together, and making sure that all the efforts that are pointing towards addressing this polycrisis or the energy disruptions are somehow consistent, and that they can feed each other, right? All initiatives to bring people together are very much welcome. On my side, I have created this biophysical economics network a few years ago. I'm intending to relaunch it in the next few months as with a different focus. It will be a media. It will basically be an online media providing news and discussions and analysis of current affairs from a biophysical economics point of view. So it will actually try to talk to the layman, to the common person who is interested in what's going on in the world, and bring to that person perspective informed by biophysical economics, but not necessarily only, and connecting to other areas or other disciplines as well. So that's what I'm going to try to do. And of course, I will try to also connect this specific initiative with a lot of other things, including your work, Nate.
François, Nate, thank you so much for this conversation. I just want to make a quick note here how remarkable it is that your paper has not only touched on such a deep analysis of the polycrisis, but also what some of the most wise responses may be. So there is a lot for us to reflect on here. And Francois, thank you so much for making the time to join us. Nate, thank you so much for taking the time as well. And also to the FAN initiative for having the foresight to commission a paper like this. Thank you all. And for all of you that are attending with us, thank you we deeply appreciate you being here. And I want to let you know that a recording of this webinar will be made available on the omega.ngo website, as well as the Resilience Project's websites. If you're interested in receiving more invitations like this, you can register there. And we look forward to seeing you on our next event, and we'll share more information with you all shortly. Thank you so much, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.